I recently got a Retroid. It's a neat little handheld system that runs on Android and comes packed with a bunch of emulators. Mostly got it for the transparent plastic casing, which, as I'm sure you know, is the best way to contain technology. But I also got it to revisit some old favorites, like Donkey Kong Country and Mario & Luigi Superstar Saga. While I worked through my own personal classics, I figured the Retroid would be a good way for me to discover some of the real classics. Like, classic in the literary sense. Games so groundbreaking or impactful that many consider them foundational texts of the medium itself. In case you couldn't tell by the Superstar Saga name drop, I love RPGs. But I'd never actually played Final Fantasy VII, and I used to love 3D platformers, but I never actually played through Super Mario 64. And I adore horror games, okay, but I'd never played a Resident Evil or Silent Hill game. Every genre-defining game I played, none hooked me as hard as either Resident Evil or Silent Hill did. Even among the horror games that I've played, those two stand out. I think there's this expectation among some younger people that older games aren't worth playing. That the ideas and mechanics that older players loved aren't worth engaging with, either because A, the graphics are old and grody, or B, because those ideas and mechanics have been improved upon or otherwise made irrelevant by the games that have succeeded them. I was a mere baby when Silent Hill came out, and I fall for that line of thinking too. But despite their primitive 3D cameras, archaic control schemes, and inscrutably low graphics quality, these two games from nearly 30 years ago left me genuinely unsettled. In fact, I think having to fight against the archaic technical limitations of these games is what makes them so much scarier than any horror game I've ever played. I want to preface the rest of this video by saying that I don't say any of this out of some contrarian impulse or sense of nostalgia. I just told you I hadn't played Silent Hill or Resident Evil until recently. This isn't a video about how the past is always better and how modern horror games are terrible. These old games have hardware and software limitations that modern horror games just don't. And I want to analyze how those forgotten limitations worked in favor of a genuinely horrifying experience. To help us both understand what I mean when I say that the technological limitations of PS1 era horror games made them scarier, I just want to focus on the two games that I mentioned before, Silent Hill and Resident Evil. For starters, they're kind of legendary. You've likely played them or watched someone play them or learned about them through cultural osmosis. By focusing on these two, we can spend less time explaining the less important aspects of the game. We want to focus on how the technical aspects heighten the horror of a game's solid narrative foundation. Like, one of the most effective tension-building elements of both games are their tank controls and fixed, or mostly fixed, cameras. I think Resident Evil in particular shines here. Love 'em or hate 'em, I know I hate 'em. The game's clunky-ass counterintuitive controls add a lot of tension to moments that, while they may already be tense in context, are actually pretty safe. Running down a tight hallway with a single slow-moving zombie chasing after you probably doesn't evoke that much terror from your regular video game player. Until the camera position changes every 3 feet and the player has to stand still and physically aim if they want to shoot it. And while the combination of a fixed camera and tank controls heightens the horror atmosphere of Resident Evil, wasn't the only, or even primary reason for its inclusion. Even by 1996, when Capcom first released Resident Evil, 3D game worlds were still a brand new space for developers and players alike to explore. This time period was like the Wild West. Developers were trying just about everything to see what felt best. Because of their inexperience with 3D game design and the lack of analog sticks in some systems and controllers, developers opted to strike a deal with the devil, who gave them the idea for tank controls. And tank controls were pretty common for a while. Along with our two horror golden boys, you'd find tank controls in such masterpieces as Grim Fandango, Tomb Raider, and Bubsy 3D. You know, I gotta be honest, Bubsy's really scary. I'm sure it's common knowledge at this point, but the reason Resident Evil and its older remakes have such high poly count character models and clear backgrounds for the time is because the 3D environments weren't 3D at all. Well, they technically weren't. At least not in-game. See, the character models are all 3D, and they walk around in a 3D space. But the space they walk around in is never rendered visible. Instead, 2D images of pre-rendered 3D scenes were rendered in real time behind the actual 3D stuff. To be able to fully render 3D environments in such detail, in real time, in 1996, would have required more disk space and better hardware than was available at the time. In other words, this was the only way the developers could bring their vision of the Spencer Mansion to life. Because the game was rendered like this, the camera needed to stay in place to keep up the illusion of a fully 3D environment. A mobile camera, or one that was player-controlled, would just make it look like Jill was getting smaller and smaller as she walked towards a wall. And because the camera needed to stay in place, tank controls, ironically, had to be used, so that the transition from shot to shot or room to room would be seamless. Otherwise, the player might get completely disoriented when walking around between shots, something that happens pretty frequently. You press forward, and your character walks the way they're facing, anywhere, even between rooms. In essence, the directional inputs were calculated relative to the room instead of to the camera, as is so often the case today. That's just one example of how technological constraints led to heightened elements of horror, though. For another example, we should turn to Silent Hill, another survival horror game with tank controls and a semi-fixed camera that came out 3 years after Resident Evil. By the time 1999 rolled around, developers could render richly detailed, fully 3D scenes in real time, and Silent Hill took full advantage of these technological advances. Each wall and street sign and item on the convenience store shelf is rendered in what would have been almost photorealistic quality for the time. Obviously, though, PS1-era consoles still had their limitations and could only render so many high-quality assets at a time. Limitations like that pose a problem for open-level games like Silent Hill, where the whole town can be freely explored. But the developers came up with an ingenious workaround: cloak the whole town in fog. Now, fog is something you still see in modern horror games. The fog in Amnesia, The Dark Descent immediately comes to mind. Hell, fog has always been something of a horror staple, right? Think of Stephen King's The Mist, or basically any haunted house from the last 100 years of visual media. But unlike Silent Hill's fog, I don't think Amnesia's fog is there purely or primarily for some technological limitation. Computing has come a long way since 1999. It's not distance fog, a term used to describe the way older games shaped faraway objects to mask the distracting clipping and pop-ins needed to render those properly in the 90s. In other words, the fog in Silent Hill was primarily used to hide the horrible clipping issues that the hardware of the era necessitated, and the developers just elegantly worked it into the game's narrative. Silent Hill's iconic, much-lauded fog creates a creepy atmosphere that's still genuinely tense on contemporary playthroughs. Even when you get the radio that alerts you to the presence of monsters, the fog still hides things from you. What twisted, rotting horror is about to come swinging out of the void at me? The dogs? The babies that disemboweled me at the beginning of the game? Or those stupid fucking birds? God damn it, not again, I hate these fucking things. You can only hurt them with the gun, unless you want to waste like 15 minutes waiting for one to land so you can punch it to death, and they're weirdly hard to hit, so they just waste your time and your bullets. There's another horror-heightening technological limitation in Silent Hill that I want to talk about, but it's a lot more subtle. If you've been paying attention to the background footage, you might have noticed that I played through the game on its native resolution. Even though I captured the footage in an emulator, perfectly legal copy of Silent Hill by the way, hope that goes without saying, on a pretty modern PC, where I could easily upscale it, I decided to intentionally leave the game in its native resolution. See, Silent Hill's low native resolution and low draw distance add another layer of fog to the environment. Because even in relatively clear environments, like the school, the monsters shambling around the corners still aren't super detailed from that far away. The game's limited draw distance reduces most far-off enemies to pixelated blobs of meat. All you've got to go on is what you can see, and what you can see isn't clear. There's some ambiguity as to what exactly is coming at you, as to what it looks like. Is it one of those harmless ghosts? Another demon child? Or is it that thing that I just heard growl in the boiler room? And what's more, this effect would have been heightened on the old standard CRT TVs that this game would have been played on in the 90s and aughts. All of these technological limitations build up the sense of ambiguity that makes these games, and good horror in general, so much more tense and scary than they would be otherwise. In other words, the uncertainty created by the limited processing power of the 90s makes good horror in the same way that the don't show the monster trope does, by limiting the amount of information the audience has access to. But the technological limitations of the time are horrifying in another way as well. They can be really uncanny. For those unacquainted with the concept of the uncanny, I'll explain it here real quick. Even if you've never heard of the uncanny, you've probably heard of the uncanny valley, the point at which animatronics or CGI characters look realistic but just manufactured enough to set off alarm bells. Looking at you, Polar Express. And if you're familiar with that, you're already pretty familiar with the concept. Something you know, a human being in the case of the uncanny valley, becomes uncanny when the subtle visual cues in its movement or how the light plays on its skin don't quite pass the vibe check. Put in very basic terms, the uncanny is the familiar made unfamiliar. Of our horror golden boys, Silent Hill utilizes uncanniness to the greatest effect. The game initially places the player in the all-too-familiar, and possibly even comforting, locale of a small American town in the 90s. But the streets are completely empty and silent. Hey, I get it now. Fog makes the town of Silent Hill uncanny enough. But once those silent, safe streets fill up with the dreadful drone of radio static and the piercing cries of monsters, baby, you got an uncanny going. I could talk for another hour about how the other world fits into all of this, but this isn't a video essay about the use of the uncanny in Silent Hill, which maybe I'll do someday. I just wanted to mention this to show how one technological limitation can elevate the horror of a game in myriad ways. But I also want to bring up Silent Hill's use of the uncanny to point out how use of contemporary settings, as the town of Silent Hill would have been for players in 1999, can really elevate the horror of a given story. This is something that, again, we see in horror games today. Like Fog, contemporary settings have always been a staple of horror. Taking a place of familiarity to your audience and warping it into something unsafe and alien before their eyes has proven itself to be one of the best ways to unsettle them. But what if a game uncanifies someplace safer? More nostalgic, even? Well, you'd get Silent Hill's experience today. I think a big part of the reason Silent Hill remains so terrifying, even if you didn't play it when it came out, or even if you weren't alive when it came out, is because of nostalgia. The town and its characters were familiar to audiences in the 90s, but the passage of time has rendered them even more familiar, safe, and rose-tinted to us today. The more fondly you hold on to something, the more disturbed you'll feel when it gets twisted into something almost unrecognizable. It can feel almost like a repressed memory bubbling to the surface. You start to doubt your own memories, your own mind. Was your childhood as idyllic as you remember? What other horrible things lie in wait, turning just below those halcyon days of youth? You might have noticed that I titled the video PS1 Games Are Scarier. And then you might have thought, wait, well, that's weird. What does he mean by are? Shouldn't it be were? They hardly ever re-release PS1 games. That console's been dead for a long time. More likely, though, you didn't notice. Or if you did, you didn't think anything of it. And that's alright. Cause see, I'm about to explain that I was actually being intentional. Believe it or not, they do still make PS1 games. Kind of. There exists a growing movement of indie horror games adopting PS1 era aesthetics. You can find them all over the horror tags on Steam and indie game sites like itch.io, including the annual Game Disc demo collection, Haunted PS1 Demo Disc. Every game demo in a Haunted PS1 library takes on the appearance of, well, a Haunted PS1 game. They rock the same low poly graphics and distance fog and low resolutions as the games of the PS1 era. There's an argument to be made that we're seeing the PS1 aesthetic more and more in indie spaces because lower quality assets are cheaper, less time consuming, and easier to produce. Or that we're seeing the aesthetic rise up as the 90s enters its time in the 30-year cycle of pop culture. I think both of those arguments have some merit, but I don't think they tell the whole story. Because, they're cheap even free assets on the Unity and Unreal asset stores that are higher poly count, boasting higher resolution textures. In other words, you could make a nice modern looking game with relative ease now. Plus, though the 30-year cycle is definitely a factor in the rise of this aesthetic, we're mostly seeing the PS1 aesthetic appear in horror or horror-adjacent titles. I think the developers of these titles know how, by emulating the graphical limitations of the PS1 era, they make their games that much scarier. I think a perfect example of this is a short, 10-minute PS1-styled retro horror game called Location Withheld Demake. I'm going to look at this not because it's the best or scariest PS1-style retro horror game I've played, but rather because it's actually a demake of the original Location Withheld, which is a much more modern-looking game. Other than their graphics and the controls that those graphics necessitated, these games are basically identical. Same room, same puzzles, same story. The juxtaposition of a modern-looking horror game and an identical retro-looking one allows us to easily see what I mean when I say that technical limitations of PS1-era games, even when simulated, heighten the horror of a given game. Location Withheld was the first, so let's start there. Upon pressing start, the game greets you with a lovingly detailed office. The game is set around 1:30 p.m. on February 13th, 1994. A Sunday, not a Friday. So, not Friday the 13th, if you were curious. And the various bits of dated technology seem to confirm the date. Pale afternoon light snakes in between the blinds to fill the room, confirming the time. Most things on the desk are fully interactable. You can pound on the keys of the Paleolithic mobile phone or press the snooze button on the alarm clock. Overall, the office in the original Location Withheld is incredibly immersive. Like, it feels as though I'm actually sitting in that office chair, trying to navigate this unfamiliar office and piece together the clues. Switch over to the Location Withheld demake, however, and the vibe's different. From the second you hit play, the Location Withheld demake starts ratcheting up the tension as right away you notice the aspect ratio is kept at 4:3 instead of the original's 16:9. With an aspect ratio that comparatively small, it feels as though the game is trying to hide something from the player. Already, we can see how imitating certain elements common to PS1 games, in this case, the aspect ratio of TVs that PS1 games would have been played on, limits the player's periphery by simply hacking it off. Another, admittedly bigger difference is how the game renders each model. In the original, you could see the objects react to the light, and it felt like you could practically reach into your monitor and feel those object models with your grubby little gamer hands. In the demake, however, every model is low poly, sharp and flat. The low resolution filter compresses color depth and pixelates anything more than an inch in front of your character's face, rendering most objects in the room just inscrutable. Like, the framed photo of the woman becomes ghostly as her facial features get compressed into a white void, which, no spoilers, ends up being a stronger piece of foreshadowing than its original counterpart, in my opinion. The poster above the desk, which looked eerie enough before, becomes downright unsettling as the colors and resolution get squashed. The game tells you it's a photo of some rolling hills, but to me it looks like a sailing ship at sea during a storm, unaware of the apocalyptic tidal wave rearing up behind it. Now, admittedly, I might be biased here because I'm more terrified of the ocean than of fields of grain, but the pixelated poster really ties the creepy office together. Adding to the uncertainty, the game's lighting engine tries to look as primitive as possible. What I mean by that is, the lighting is much more one-dimensional than the original. The blinds don't cast a shadow as light pours in from the window, neither does the chair you're sitting in. The flat lighting makes the whole room look a little darker, a little warmer, as though it were dark enough outside for the fan to be the only source of light in the room. I started my Location Withheld experience with the demake, and for the longest time, I thought it was night. I thought that the light from outside was a street light, and that the reading of 1:34 p.m. on the alarm clock was some kind of supernatural glitch. But after playing the original version, where it is very clearly an overcast afternoon with light enough to stream in through the window, I had to reevaluate my demake playthroughs. Simply imitating the lighting of an old game engine presents a very uncanny feeling to the whole scene. The cloud of intellectual uncertainty casts an unsettling pall over the demake. Time and again we'll see the demake deprives the player of information in ways that the original simply couldn't. The less you know, the less you control, and the scarier the situation gets. We can see that theft of information at work in the interactability of the game too. As I mentioned earlier, in the original version of the game, you can pick up and interact with most objects in the scene. The demake, however, severely limits the interactability of the scene. Instead of picking up an object when you click on it, the game displays a pre-rendered image of the object and overlays a blurb of text describing what you're looking at, kind of like Silent Hill. Where in the original you could plainly see what an object was by looking at it and discern its usefulness by turning it around and clicking on it, the demake takes your hand and asks you to trust it in its descriptions. With its atmosphere as uncanny as it is, the demake can feel untrustworthy or manipulative at times. Like, is that pamphlet in the trash really useless? I think of the painting of the cabin on the far wall. In the original, you could just look at it and draw your own conclusions about it, as you would any piece of art. The demake, however, tells you that it's lonely and being watched. The relative loss of interactability makes the game feel less open. You don't have to stumble through a bunch of red herring objects to find something useful. The game will let you know when you've found something useful right away. It creates a feeling of helplessness almost. So the game has strapped you into that desk chair and is rolling you slowly but surely towards some horrifying conclusion. Compared to its original counterpart, the location withheld demake feels less like an immersive simulation than a nightmare of the mundane. A cocktail of old experiences and recent memories that leave the player feeling unsettled on a more fundamental level. The location withheld demake is a shining example of how devolving a horror game can add uncertainty and take away control to heighten the horror of the whole experience. I started writing this video essay after I played the haunted PS1 demo disc for 2021. Something about the whole experience just possessed me, I guess. From the moment I walked into the showcase to the moment I clicked exit, the demos and their abandoned museum framing device got me thinking about video games and their history in ways I'd never done before. I think back on my time with Loveland, my favorite demo of the bunch, and how its ancient resolution made the whole thing creepier. Like, near the front of the trailer park, you see a couple of lights in the woods beyond the fence. I couldn't figure out whether they were eyes or utility lights, and I couldn't get close enough to tell. And when something thrashes around in the frog room of trailer 104 and leaps out of the window, I couldn't get close enough to tell if those were eyes either, though I suspect they were. Creepy as it was, like the location withheld demake, it felt comfortably nostalgic as well. A compelling and unsettling clash of emotions that stuck to me like frog repellent to a frog. I felt like I'd been exposed to a new dimension for video games as a medium. A dimension in which developers wield 30 years of hindsight to turn against the inexorable march of progress to rediscover and repurpose all the valuable techniques that the industry has left behind. Playing and developing old-school horror games like Loveland or the location withheld demake can be an act of nostalgic archaeology. And in uncertain times like these, where nostalgia is both a commodity and an escape, playing PS1-style retro horror games can serve as an uncomfortable reckoning with the past. Like Gothic revenants, the echoes of Resident Evil and Silent Hill seem to crawl forth from our psyches, possessing and transforming games that were in development only a year ago. And like Gothic revenants, these games feel like a new way for developers and players alike to reflect on themselves and the world they were raised in, to challenge their own nostalgia. Through new projects like these, we can reconcile the halcyon days of distance fog and CRT TVs with how those halcyon days are shaping the uncertain future to come.